The call that shattered Dan Morrison's world came at 2 a.m., the kind of hour when nothing good survives, and every sound feels like a warning from life itself. He sat in his dim Chicago apartment. The thin walls, the rattling radiator, the sad little nightstand from a clearance outlet, waiting for the phone to stop buzzing, as if delaying it might change what waited on the other side. When he finally answered, his mother's voice broke through the darkness like a cracked window letting in winter wind. "Your grandfather passed away tonight." For a moment, Dan felt suspended between two lives, the one cramped into a failing city existence, and the one he'd abandoned decades ago on the vast Montana ranch that shaped every Morrison man before him. The estrangement with Grandpa Tom hit like unfinished homework he'd avoided for 24 years. He glanced toward the small bedroom where his daughter, Emma, slept. 10 years old, curled up under discount store blankets, unaware her father's past was reaching through the night to claim him. Debt buried him, unemployment stalked him, and shame had become his closest companion. Yet hearing Tom was gone stirred emotions he didn't know how to carry. Regret, guilt, fear, quiet enemies awakening all at once. He whispered asterisk, "I'll be there," though he barely believed it. And with that whisper, the Montana sky, so far away, seemed to pull him backward into memories of wide fields, hard lessons, and a man who never forgave him for leaving. Life, he realized, was calling him home. When morning arrived, gray and heavy like a disappointed parent, Dan finally opened his laptop to search flights he couldn't afford. Emma wandered in rubbing sleep from her eyes, her voice small but knowing. Children always sensed when the world shifted. Hearing they were going to Montana lit something in her that had been missing since the divorce. Wonder, possibility, the promise of open horizon. He booked the flights on a maxed-out card, hating himself and loving her all in the same breath. Hours later, as the plane cut across the sky, the memories came back with brutal clarity. The ranch at dawn, frost on the fields, the sun rising behind the Sweetwater Hills, and the rough hands of Grandpa Tom teaching him how to mend fences, drive cattle, and read the sky like scripture. But the ranch was also the place he had fled, desperate to avoid the same fate as his father and grandfather. Men worn down by land that demanded everything and returned little. When the plane descended over Montana, even Dan felt the shock of seeing space again, real space, ancient and endless. Emma pressed her face to the window, whispering, "It's so big." He told her almost quietly, "Wait until you see the ranch." But inside, fear twisted. He was returning not as a proud son, but as the family failure, the one who had traded saddles for spreadsheets and lost anyway. And Montana, with its stern mountains and honest wind, didn't forget betrayal. Sweetwater Ranch greeted him like a judgment. The log house sat against rolling pastures and sky that stretched wider than memory. His mother, Maggie, hugged him like someone clinging to the last familiar piece of her life. But the air inside the home still carried Tom's essence, pipe tobacco, leather, dust of generations. Photographs lined the walls. Cattle drives, storms survived, hands worn by work. Every face seemed to say, "You left, we didn't." That first night, Dan struggled to breathe under the weight of old ghosts. Jim, his father, arrived later, a man carved from wind, sun, and decades of disappointment. He barely looked at Dan as they ate in silence. He answered Emma's questions about horses and cattle, softening for her in ways he'd never softened for his son. After dinner, he announced, almost casually, "The lawyer wants to read the will on Monday." But Dan heard the tension beneath it, like barbed wire pulled too tight. When Saturday came, the funeral filled the small Methodist church to overflowing. Ranchers in their best boots, women in pressed dresses, the entire county showing respect to a legend. But Dan felt the stares. Asterisk the boy who left, the man who failed, the prodigal who didn't deserve grief. Then, like a storm cloud stepping into sunlight, Richard Thornton approached him, a developer in an expensive suit, voice coated in polite poison. "I hear you're having financial troubles. I can make you a very generous offer if you inherit." The humiliation in front of friends and strangers alike cut deeper than Dan expected. It was the beginning of a battle he never saw coming. The will reading detonated like dynamite beneath every Morrison name. In the small office on Main Street, the lawyer unfolded Tom's final wishes with a nervousness that foretold disaster. Then came the blow. Dan inherited the entire 12,000-acre ranch, every acre, every building, every dollar, on the condition that he lived there for 6 consecutive months. If he failed, the ranch would be transferred to the state. Jim, who had devoted his life to that land, received almost nothing. The silence afterward felt like the earth itself stopped turning. Maggie cried. Jim stared through the window as if deciding whether to shatter it or climb through it. Dan sat stunned, unable to understand why the man who'd been hardest on him had trusted him most. Then Thornton arrived, smiling like a man who smelled blood, and offered $2 million on the spot asterisk, whispering that Montana winters were dangerous for city people. Jim's rage finally broke, telling him to get out, but the damage was done. Back at the ranch, Dan opened Tom's private letter, hands shaking. The words were simple, shocking, and impossible. A hidden secret worth millions, a discovery from 1875, a danger that still lived. Trust Clara, trust no one else, especially not Thornton. The land didn't just hold cattle, it held something people would kill for. Dan looked out at the fields, realizing the inheritance wasn't a gift. It was a burden, a warning, and a challenge from a dead man he barely understood. Those first weeks nearly broke him. The land didn't care about grief, financial ruin, or fatherly intentions. It demanded work, real work, and punished those who didn't know how to answer. Dan failed at everything. He mangled fences, spooked horses, bruised ribs, and dignity. Word traveled fast in the valley, people drove by just to watch him struggle. But then Jake Patterson arrived, Tom's old friend, a man built from sawdust, sweat, and truth. With a voice like gravel and a heart hidden beneath sarcasm, Jake said, "You don't know your ass from a fence post. Let's fix that." Over the next weeks, Jake taught him ranching the way old-timers teach survival, through calloused hands, repetition, and silent expectations. Emma found joy for the first time in months, exploring pastures with her new friend Lucy, breathing air untouched by city noise. Meanwhile, Clara, the housekeeper who had served the family for 40 years, kept watching Dan with a quiet knowing. She offered cryptic hints about the house, its age, its secrets. Then came the discovery. Emma found a dusty trunk in the attic containing letters from their ancestor Jacob Morrison. The letters described a discovery, dangerous, valuable, hidden through a secret map only the family could decipher. Tom hadn't been delusional, he'd been protecting something. With each clue, Dan realized he wasn't just learning how to ranch. He was being drawn into a generational mystery, with stakes far greater than cattle or land. The clues led them to the truth in pieces, through photographs, measurements, shadows, and the house itself. Jacob's codes pointed toward a hidden mineshaft buried beneath 150 years of rock and time. Behind the numbers lay something powerful enough that Jacob had died protecting it. Dan and Jake finally uncovered the entrance deep in the northwestern ridge, but before they could excavate properly, sabotage began. Fences were cut. Water pumps filled with sand, tires slashed, cattle scattered. Sheriff Cooper found nothing he could legally act on, but everyone knew who was behind it. Thornton wanted the land, desperately, dangerously. At the shaft they worked nights, cold, illegal, determined, to dig through the collapse. On the winter solstice, dawn light streamed through Tom's study at the exact angle Jacob predicted. Symbols appeared on the floorboards, invisible all year except that one moment. Beneath them lay a sealed box containing Jacob's final map, and the original claim certificate verifying the mine's ownership. Dan raced to call Jake, only to find the mine collapsed again, but this time by human hands. Jake was trapped inside. Hours of desperate digging saved him, but the message was unmistakable. Thornton wasn't just threatening. He was willing to kill. Dan realized the battle had turned lethal. Protecting the ranch meant protecting Emma, Jake, Clara, and the truth itself. He couldn't walk away anymore, not with blood now tangled in the soil and history demanding courage from him. The war exploded into the public eye after Dan exposed the mine's existence to the press. His story spread across Montana, then the region, then national outlets. Small rancher, single father, hidden gold, corrupt developer. Donations poured in from strangers who saw themselves in his struggle. With the funds, he hired Patricia Chen, a relentless attorney who dissected Thornton's forged documents piece by piece. The forensic evidence was damning. Clara revealed Thornton's threats to Tom days before his death. Then Marcus Webb, Thornton's own lawyer, broke under the weight of his conscience and delivered recordings proving sabotage, bribery, and attempted murder. The trial became a modern Western showdown inside a century-old courthouse, the jury filled with people who knew the land like scripture. Chen presented the forged signatures, the metadata, the intimidation, the break-line attack meant for Emma. The prosecutor described a man who believed he could buy anything, including silence. Emma sat in the front row holding Lucy's hand, watching her father stand taller than she'd ever seen him. When Webb testified, exposing Thornton's orders in detail, the courtroom froze. Thornton's arrogance evaporated, replaced by an expression as pale as Montana frost. The jury deliberated only 3 hours. They ruled in Dan's favor on every count: fraud, harassment, attempted forcible takeover. The judge froze Thornton's assets and referred the criminal elements to federal authorities. For the first time in months, Dan felt like he could breathe. Sweetwater Ranch, Jacob's secret, and Emma's future were finally safe. Spring arrived like forgiveness. Snow melted off the ridge, revealing green that stretched for miles, as if the land itself recognized the battle had ended. Dan stood on the porch each morning watching the horses graze, listening to Emma's laughter echo across the yard. Bright, unburdened, alive. The mine, now legally his, was sealed until it could be studied safely. But the fortune Jacob left behind was already changing everything, not through greed but through possibility. Dan paid off debts, repaired the ranch, established a college fund for Emma, and created a trust for the community that had saved his life as much as his land. Jim returned quietly one day, standing at the fence line like a man unsure if he still belonged. Dan walked out to meet him without anger. They didn't speak much, Morrison men didn't, but in that silence came something like healing. Montana had broken Dan once, but returning had rebuilt him in ways he never expected. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold, Emma asked him, "Daddy, do you think Great-Grandpa Tom knew all this would happen?" Dan smiled softly. "I think he knew I'd have to fight for something before I understood its worth." He realized then that